Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you haven't been here before, I am Debbie and I read a lot of books. Today I have finished a classic that I have never read before, and that book is 1984 by George Orwell. A lot of people read this book at school. I didn't read any George Orwell at school. I don't even know why, it wasn't on my syllabus, but I've always heard about it. And for somebody who had kind of grown to quite enjoy dystopias, I've read a couple back to back actually, yeah, I thought it'd be interesting to finally read it. So for those that don't know what it's about, the blurb on here says that it is arguably the 20th century's most famous novel. Dystopian study of political tyranny, mind control, paranoia and secret mass surveillance. It follows Winston Smith, a diligent desk clerk at the Ministry of Truth. It paints a disturbing portrait of a totalitarian regime when even the thoughts of residents are censored. And it talks about the new paperback and everything. But yeah, so the tagline is, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." This was actually quite a short book. I didn't realise how short it was. It's 230 pages. I was in a similar boat with Animal Farm because that one wasn't many pages at all. That one was in 230 pages as well. I think on my iPad it comes across as more like 100 or so pages, but it's just because it's a small screen. It's a tiny screen. Well, it's not a tiny screen, but yeah. So what did I think of this book? Having just finished The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, I was reading both of them at the same time, so I was very easily seeing the 1984 George Orwellian influence on The Memory Police, because there were things that I was reading in both books that were eerily similar to each other, and I don't really know how to describe that. I just felt the influence as I was reading The Memory Police. 1984, the book, it's split into 3 parts. First part kind of throws you straight into the world and meeting Winston Smith and what he does every day, and you becoming aware of the life that he is living under the scrutiny of Big Brother, where there's cameras everywhere, there are televisions everywhere, and the people on the television can communicate with people through the televisions. There's something that was written, what was this, the 40s? 49. I was right, it was written in the 40s, but it was the late 40s. It was originally published 8th of June 1949. Of the 3 parts, as I said, in the first part, your kind of introduction to the world and to Winston and what he is doing and what his role is in it. The second part is meeting the girl, kind of. You're already aware of the girl, but it's when the relationship starts. And then the third part is, well, getting caught. And I'll admit, for a classic, I enjoyed it. The third part was probably my favourite because it's where the most action happens. Because after I'd finished it, I actually said to my dad, is it weird that the part that I enjoyed the most is the bit that has the torture in it? And then as I really thought about it, it was like, no, it's not the fact that it's the torture bit that's why I'm enjoying it. But yeah, it's just that the third part, part 3, is the most active part after all this setup. Because there were points in the second part where I almost felt like I was glazing over slightly, because a lot of it is Winston reading this book, which is the origins of Big Brother and the party and all the wars. He's reading this textbook to Julia, the girlfriend, and so through that I was just kind of glazing over slightly. It was like, I felt like it was just getting very repetitive and I was seeing the same thing over and over again, and that's also repeated in the third part. And I was reading it in the third part, I was thinking, this was like really good monologue, because there's certain characters in the third part that talk for a very long time trying to explain what they're doing. And I was just reading it thinking, this is very reminiscent of part 2, where we were already given this information. And this character is also explaining his own role in it. And yeah, it's fascinating for something that was written in 1949 about 1984, but it's still being so relevant in 2023. And also the fact that so many things from this, it's either we've taken stuff from this book and made it a real thing, or we've gone in the complete opposite direction. Because what I found really interesting in this book was how they're talking about slimlining the dictionary and vocabulary And so instead of having a million different words for good and bad, it's just good and ungood. But when you look at how language has evolved, we're adding more words to the dictionary. Which generation came up with the word selfie? Excuse me, I've still got this horrible cough after the cold that I had. Well, it was kind of borderline cold flu because I was just stayed in bed for about 2 days. But yeah, this cough just won't go and it's really annoying. Yeah, and it's because Winston, the main character that you are seeing all of this through, he works at the Ministry of Truth and he's in kind of rewriting history. So it's kind of like the idea of like, because the Times still exists, obviously it still does in various formats, but it's like the Times newspaper, and he's sent things where it's just like, right, we need to rewrite this, we need to edit this so it matches what we're telling people. And that's where I got the eerie feeling when it came to rewriting history, because we are at a point when it seems a lot of people want to kind of not rewrite it but erase history because they don't realise we need to learn from it. In the case of this book, it's just that they don't want anything contradicting what the party is trying to convince people of. Because there's even like a whole paragraph page when it comes to like the book that Winston is told to read because it lays the groundwork for the party and what they've been doing, and also the character in the third part who is telling Winston that how people can be manipulated basically. And yeah, it's just very current and kind of terrifying that stuff is still happening that's so similar to what happens in this book. And the fact is, it's obvious that this wasn't just completely made up. This is like looking at politics and how people can be manipulated and how it is so easy to brainwash people into thinking something. Because it was like, just looking at modern politics, like with the conversations I've had with my dad about politics, because he was a civil servant before he retired, and he was just like, when it comes to politicians, you can't believe a word they're saying, basically, because basically a lot of the time it's just noise, because they're trying to distract you from what they're actually doing. Just popping that out there for people who don't understand that. So, if you're seeing lots of nonsense on the news and you're just thinking, why is this news? It's because they're trying to do something behind the scenes and they don't really want the public to know about it. And this happens a lot in this book, where it seems like they're doing lots of stuff at the front to distract people. And yeah, this could only become politics driven, this video, in regards to this book. I mean, one of the things that really had me comparing this and the Memory Police was the Thought Police, where it's the idea that they are, as it says, they're kind of a secret police of the superstate, Oceania, and they discover and punish thought crime, which is kind of like personal political thoughts unapproved by the regime. And yeah, that's fairly self-explanatory, isn't it? Basically, anything that you think which doesn't agree with what they're trying to tell you, they're going to police that. And that's where I was getting my similarities to the Memory Police, because in the Memory Police, they are purposely taking things away and manipulating people's memories so that they either forget things, they're forced to get rid of things, and then anybody who can remember, they are trying to take away because of some unknown reason, whether they want to study them or whether they're trying to torture them. You don't know in the Memory Police because it gives you no answers. Whereas in 1984, you are given every single answer. Throughout the entire book, you are told about how the regime was kind of put in place, how it started, what their ultimate plan is. So, but even when you know what the ultimate plan is, it's not a happy ending. But yeah, just the idea of, because obviously you've got the different states. Yeah, so Oceania is the main one, it's led by Big Brother. You can see where we got the idea of Big Brother from. And basically they're constantly changing who they're at war with. And then once they've decided who they're at war with, they then manipulate to make people think that they've been at war with that state for the whole time, when actually they keep swapping and switching. Because, yeah, just the manipulation throughout all of it is terrifying. The fact that Orwell himself described his book as a satire, and it just yeah, the idea of satire, but the fact that it's also so relevant and so current. Yeah. Because satire is usually generally supposed to be kind of funny. 1984 isn't funny. It might have been at the time, but looking back on it, it's terrifying because we know how much of it has either come true or we've taken stuff from it and developed things from it, like the idea of Big Brother, with the fact that there is surveillance everywhere. You know, the American government has my fingerprint because that's how travel works. Disney World has my fingerprint. And, you know, there's cameras everywhere. Like, if they wanted to, they could turn up to my house and just decide to pin something on me. If they wanted to. Not that I'm saying that that would happen, but, you know, it's that whole thing of just, like, nobody can truly be off the grid, really. So, yeah. I mean, people try to live off the grid, but I don't think it's... Do I think it's physically possible to live off the grid in 2023? I don't think it is. Because at some point there would be something out there. Because the same as it's on the internet, it lives forever. I just found it incredibly interesting. As I said, I thought the third part was the part where it had the most stuff happening. And when the relationship between Vincent and Julia started, I was just like, I'm not quite sure if I believe this relationship or not. Mainly because I was wondering what Julia had to gain from that relationship. But I feel like it was a little bit of a red herring, so there was that point where I was just thinking, well, what does she see in him? When you hear him describing himself, is there something that is to be gained for Julia? But then, at the same time, she's the one who takes him out into places where there isn't any surveillance. So that they can have their private time. It's just like, if she really wanted to gain something out of it, she could have taken him to somewhere which did have surveillance, but she claimed didn't. This is just me because I finished this about a day ago. It's just been stewing and I've been thinking about kind of what I think of it. It's another one of those books where to say I enjoyed it would be the wrong word, but I found it incredibly interesting, incredibly thought-provoking, and this would have been such an incredible book to study. I'm sure there'll be people out there who kind of hate this book because they had to study it, but when you don't have that kind of added thing of knowing that you need to break down every single word, every single sentence, every single part of the story and compare it to maybe like the world wars and everything that this book came off of because of when it was written. Because I don't have all that, it allowed me to just sit and read it and appreciate it for what it was, but then also look at it from a 21st century point of view, and that is what makes it scary. That is what makes it terrifying. And also seeing how this book became so big to the point where we essentially created a form of Big Brother. And then we also took the idea of Room 101 and turned it into, what was it, a television show. I think it was on the radio at one point. It was almost as if George Orwell was kind of predicting the future. I know his name isn't actually George Orwell, it was a pseudonym. Eric Arthur Blair. And he died in 1950, so I'm not sure. Was this one of his last books? I think this might have actually been his last book, which is very interesting. It's weird to think that he could be looking down now and seeing how this book affected people and the world. Would he have known how big a deal this book was going to become? The fact that he himself said that this book was supposed to be a satire, and at the time, coming off of the wars and everything that this book was influenced by, maybe it was accepted more as a satire when it first came out, but then nowadays we just see it as almost a horror. But yeah, I just found it fascinating. It's in dystopia, political fiction and social science fiction. Yeah, and it's basically set in London, which is now Airstrip 1, Oceania. Just completely fascinating. And also, I can also see the similarities between this and Animal Farm, because they feel like very similar stories. It's just obviously in Animal Farm, it's done from the point of view of the animals, and in this case, he's just turned into people. But at the same time, through the politics of both books, even in this book, he refers to the people in power as being animals, which I find an incredible comparison. And again, would have been something really interesting to look at if I did study it at school, even just comparing the two George Orwell books, Animal Farm and 1984, and looking at the similarities and the differences and how they seem to influence each other, because it seemed that Animal Farm was directly before this book, so he wrote Animal Farm and then he wrote 1984, or at least that's how they were released anyway. You do wonder how much of him writing Animal Farm, if that was kind of giving him the ideas for what would later become 1984, because there are similarities in regards to how the references to people in power being animals and pigs, and obviously in Animal Farm the pigs were the ones kind of trying to run the show. And then at the very end of Animal Farm, when they're looking through the window at the pigs and the farmers, and they're saying about how the pigs are starting to look like the humans and the humans are starting to look like the pigs and how similar they're looking, and then this really goes into the idea of basically pigs running this political party, like they're pigs in more than one sense of the word, if that makes sense. Yeah, I feel like I could go on and on and on, but I just found it fascinating. It says it's an imagined future, unknown year but believed to be 1984, where it's just in a perpetual war. This super state led by Big Brother, who there's not actually technically a person behind it, but a group of people, and they are just trying to influence and take any form of memory out of them and basically just resort them to nothing, essentially. And throughout all of it, it always comes back to the fact that Winston can remember. And he sees things, but it's just like, wait, weren't we at war with that one just 6 months ago? Didn't I see a picture that proved that those people weren't actually anything to do with this? And it also comes back to the fact that his job is to manipulate everything, but on Big Brother's orders. Yeah. I don't know what I've said there. Yeah. Just fascinating, terrifying, incredible, and I find this quite an important book, really, especially for now, in a place where we get a lot of sensitivity regarding history, and people not exactly trying to erase history, but kind of wanting to forget it a bit. Obviously you do have the people who try to deny that stuff happened, and it's just like, you can't deny that it happened. You can't deny that it happened, because it did happen, and we have the recorded history of that. What we don't want to happen is what happened in 1984, where you do actually have people at the top who are going, actually, we do kind of want to erase that history. We don't want people to remember. We don't want people to learn from those mistakes. But obviously, we do want to learn from the mistakes. You can't erase history. Yeah, you can look at things in a new light and go, that by today's standards, what that person did was horrible. Like the idea in like 2020 when people were like throwing statues into rivers and things, and it was just like, it's okay not to worship these people. But you also have to remember that nothing's black and white, and a lot of it is a product of its own time. Like, just for example, just looking at an episode of Friends. I was watching an episode of Friends, which was from like season 1 or season 2, and with my dad the other night, and we were looking at it and thinking, oh god, that kind of comedy wouldn't actually stand today, because it's kind of cringy, it's kind of offensive. It was the episode in regards to when Rachel gives Ross the letter, and Rachel convinces his current girlfriend to shave her head. The jokes at that character's expense, that wouldn't fly. It is weird to compare a couple of episodes of Friends to something like this, but it's just that some things are of the time that they were made, and it's okay to admit that, yeah, you wouldn't get away with that today. But also, at the time, that was almost considered a bit progressive. Not that exact Friends storyline, but at the time, what Friends was doing was progressive for the 90s. But now we can also look back and say, oh, if we made it now, like, we wouldn't have all 6 friends just completely white. even though they did do things in regards to like bringing in like Charlie and looking at like Ross's girlfriend. What it was doing at the time was progressive for the 90s, but now we can look back and go, actually, by today's standards, that isn't as progressive as it could have been in regards to today's standards. I feel like I've gone off on a tangent. But it's just that thing of just remembering that you can't erase history, but you can learn from it, and we don't want to erase history. Anybody out there who wants to bring today's standards up to anything else made in the past, which a lot happened in 2020, to the point where we were inside, we weren't doing anything, and a lot of things became heightened. I will say to anybody of the younger generation who look at history and go, oh, but yeah, it's today, it's not then, and it was just, I know, read this book to understand why we can't let this happen, why we can't rewrite and erase history, why it needs to stay there, why it needs to stay in the history books, and just understanding that there are certain things that we can look back on, and, you know, even with regards to the statues, we're looking at all the good that person did, and then somebody else will come out and say, oh, but what about this, what about the slavery? And it was just like, at the time, they were doing what they needed to do to get through that time. It's just a case of read the book to understand why we cannot get rid of it. This book tells you what happens when you do erase it and you do allow people to forget, and what that does to people when you can't compare and you can't learn. But we need to compare and we need to learn, and that is what makes this book very important. Despite what he had in his head when he was writing it, it has become bigger than what George Orwell himself was thinking when he wrote it. So much bigger, and we need to remember that. Editing Debbie just popping on just to clarify that last section. What basically I was trying to say is that no matter what, we cannot change the history. And looking back, we can look back and say, by today's standards, a lot of stuff that happened in history was horrible. But it happened. We can't do anything about it. We can only learn from it and realise that at the time, they didn't know they were going to make it into the history books. And it's by looking at that, we realise what we can learn from it. Without it there, though, we can't learn from it. We need to know. And 1984, the book, tries to erase everything. They manufacture stuff in accordance to what their plan is. It's terrifying. It's horrifying. But it provides a context in regards to what we should allow to happen and what shouldn't be allowed to happen. I've got very passionate about this book. I just found it incredibly important. Anyway, that was my clarification. Hopefully you understand what I'm saying here. But yeah, so thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. And I will see you next time with another video. Stay safe.